When two tiny grizzly cubs were found abandoned on a remote mountain trail, no one believed they would survive. But what happened next stunned wildlife experts. A mother dog, grieving her lost litter, did something no one expected: she took them in as her own. What started as a desperate rescue turned into a bond that would defy biology and melt even the hardest hearts. And years later, their reunion would leave everyone in tears. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the channel, like this video, and turn on notifications. These true emotional stories deserve to be shared, and you'll help us bring more of them to life. Get ready for a story about love without limits and a mother's heart that didn't care about species. The snow came earlier than expected that year in northern Montana. Rangers had closed most of the backcountry trails, and only the stubborn stayed behind: trappers, hikers who knew how to read the sky, and ranchers like Grace Harper. Grace lived alone now. Her husband had passed 3 winters earlier, and her only company was her dog, Rosie, a 5-year-old German shepherd with a thick black and tan coat and intelligent, watchful eyes. Rosie had just lost her litter 2 weeks before: complications. All of them gone in one cold night. She hadn't been the same since. Grace, too. On a Thursday morning just after dawn, Grace set out toward the Old West Trail to clear a fallen tree. Rosie was ahead, nose to the ground, moving with slow precision. The woods were quiet. Too quiet. Then Rosie stopped. Her ears perked. She let out a sharp, controlled bark. Grace caught up and saw it: a mound of fur in the snow. No. 2 tiny, shivering, barely breathing bear cubs. Grizzly cubs. No mother in sight. Grace knew better than to touch them. Bears don't abandon their young unless something happened to them. She looked for signs: tracks, blood, movement in the trees. Nothing. The cubs whimpered weakly. And then something incredible happened. Rosie stepped forward, crouched low, and gently nudged one of the cubs with her snout. It responded. The smallest one reached out a paw and touched her front leg. Grace's breath caught. It was impossible, but it was happening. She made a decision. Against every rule in the book, she wrapped the cubs in her coat, tucked them into a canvas sled, and pulled them back home. Rosie never left their side. That night, Grace made a bed of hay and blankets in the barn. She mixed a formula with goat milk and a warm dropper. The cubs cried softly. Rosie pressed against them, lying protectively around their tiny bodies, her head resting between them. Grace stood in the doorway, watching through tears. It was like watching grief heal itself in real time. For the first time since her husband's death and Rosie's loss, there was warmth again, not just in the barn, but in Grace's chest and in Rosie's heart. By morning, the barn smelled of milk, hay, and something unfamiliar. Something wild. Grace stepped in with a bowl of warm formula and paused. Rosie was still curled around the cubs, her black and tan coat blending into the straw, her eyes alert but gentle. One cub, the smaller of the 2, was snuggled under her chin. The other was pawing gently at her shoulder, as if playfully testing her. Grace whispered, "What are we doing?" She knelt beside them and checked their breathing. Steady. Bellies rounder. Eyes still closed, but starting to flutter. They were fighting. Fighting to live. Grace knew the law. Grizzly bears were federally protected. It was illegal to shelter or raise one without authorization, even in a crisis like this. The right call was to notify Fish and Wildlife. Let them take over. But she also knew what would happen. The cubs would be taken to a holding center, evaluated, and likely euthanized if they showed signs of too much human contact. Cubs that bonded with people or dogs rarely made it back to the wild. They'd be seen as a threat. As tainted. Grace looked at Rosie, now calmly grooming the paw of the cub that had whimpered all night. They weren't tainted. They were loved. That afternoon, she called a friend, Marcus, a retired ranger who now worked in wildlife rehab. She didn't give her name. Just the facts. I found 2 abandoned cubs. Eyes barely open. No mother. Call it in, Marcus said. I didn't say I have them, she lied. A pause on the line. Then Marcus added softly, if someone were to keep them warm for a few days, until they're stronger. I'd understand. Grace's throat tightened. Thanks. He hung up. No names. No records. Just Grace. For Grace. Rosie adapted like she was born for it. She began guarding the barn, ears sharp, posture alert, eyes scanning every shadow. She growled at raccoons, slept lightly, and cleaned the cubs gently each morning with her tongue, just as she'd done with her own lost litter. Grace watched it all in stunned silence. The cubs didn't just survive, they began to live. They play-wrestled in the hay, climbed Rosie like a hill, cried when she stepped away. And Rosie, she became something else entirely. She wasn't just a surrogate. She was their mother. Grace kept her world small. No visitors. No mail carrier. No trips to town. Just her, the cubs, and the German shepherd who had found a reason to heal. But every day, she felt the weight. They couldn't keep this up forever. Someday, someone would find out. And when that happened, she might have to say goodbye. But that day wasn't today. And for now, love, wild, impossible love, was enough. By the end of the 3rd week, the cubs had names. Grace hadn't meant to name them. She knew what that meant. But one morning, after the bigger one knocked over a pail of milk and rolled around in it like a mischievous pup, she blurted out, "You're just a little tank, aren't you?" He responded with a snort and a tumble. The smaller one, gentler, clingier, liked to press her face into Rosie's thick fur and sleep that way for hours. Grace called her Willow. Tank and Willow. And Rosie, their mother, their guardian, their world. Rosie began teaching them things. Not consciously, but instinctively. She led them around the fenced pasture, ears forward, body poised, redirecting them from danger, icy puddles, sharp rocks. When a hawk flew too low overhead, she stepped between the cubs and barked once, firm and loud. They froze. Then crept close to her side. The cubs learned her rhythm, when to eat, when to nap, when to stay still. They gnawed at her tail, pounced on her back legs. And Rosie let them, with the patience only a real mother has. Grace hadn't seen Rosie this alive since before she lost her own pups. One cold evening, Grace brought out her old camera. She hadn't used it in years, not since her husband's final days, when everything felt too heavy to capture. Now, she couldn't help it. She crouched by the barn door as Rosie lay in a nest of hay. Tank curled beside her. Willow asleep on top of her paws. The German shepherd looked up, eyes soft but alert, posture relaxed like a sentinel allowed to rest. Grace snapped the photo and wept. But even in moments of peace, reality never strayed far. Late that night, as she cleaned the bottles in the kitchen, the radio crackled, a local wildlife bulletin. Reports of a female grizzly killed near Red Ridge Pass. Cubs believed lost. Tracks ended near Snowfall. No further signs. Grace's hands trembled. That was 15 miles from her land. They weren't abandoned. Their mother hadn't left them, she'd been taken. And now they were hers. By fate. By circumstance. By love. The next day, Grace called Marcus again. Still no name, just, what happens if cubs bond too strongly with a domestic animal? He hesitated. It's rare, but they usually don't get released. They don't know how to survive wild. What if the animal is their only chance to survive? Another pause. Then that animal did something no human could. Rosie didn't know any of this. She just carried on, protecting, feeding, mothering. The cubs were growing fast. Tank had already outgrown Rosie in length, and Willow's paws were the size of Grace's fists. Their play became more intense, mock wrestling that shook the walls of the barn. Growls deeper, movements heavier. But Rosie never flinched. When Tank accidentally knocked over a water trough, Rosie barked once, sharply. The cub froze. Rosie stood tall, chest out, ears forward. A true German shepherd in command. The message was clear, respect. He backed down immediately. Grace laughed softly, watching from the gate. Still got it, girl. But the snow told other stories. One morning, Grace found unfamiliar prints near the edge of her property. Boot prints. Fresh too. Close. She followed them for about 30 yards before they disappeared into the trees, melted slightly by sun and time. It could have been a hunter, a hiker, or worse. Someone looking for what had been reported weeks ago, missing grizzly cubs. Grace reinforced the gate, covered the barn windows with tarps, and started keeping her rifle by the kitchen door. She didn't want to use it, but she wasn't going to lose them. Not now. That week, she had to separate Rosie from the cubs for the first time. Not because of conflict, but because Rosie was limping. A sprain, maybe. Age creeping in. Grace needed to give her rest, so she moved her into the house for 2 days while the cubs stayed in the barn. The first night, they wailed. Not cried, wailed. Tank paced. Willow clawed at the gate, their noses pressed to the door, bodies shaking. Rosie barked from the porch, whining low, ears back. Grace didn't sleep. By dawn, she gave in. She opened the barn gate, and the 2 cubs came charging toward the house like shadows returning to the fire. Rosie met them on the steps, sniffing their faces, letting out soft, rhythmic whines. She stood firm, tail wagging once, then turned toward the porch. The cubs followed without hesitation. They curled up beside her in the doorway, as if nothing had changed. Later that day, Grace did something she swore she wouldn't. She wrote a letter. To whoever finds this, if I'm not here. She paused, hand trembling. They're not dangerous. They're not confused. They were loved. By a dog who lost her own. And by a woman who had nothing left to lose. She sealed it in a jar and buried it beneath the old cedar by the barn. Just in case. That night, the wind picked up. Snow swept across the field. And in the distance, a truck engine. Far off, but real. Rosie raised her head from her blanket. The cubs stirred. Grace stood at the window, staring into the dark. Someone was coming. It was just past midnight when the headlights appeared, 2 slow-moving beams slicing through the snowy trees, tires crunching over frozen ground. Grace killed the lights in the house and stepped out onto the porch, rifle slung but lowered. Rosie stood beside her, motionless, her thick coat bristling in the cold, ears alert, a low growl rumbling from deep in her chest. From the barn came the soft sound of shifting hay. The cubs were awake too. The truck stopped at the end of the drive. A door creaked open. Footsteps in the snow. Then a voice. "Grace." She froze. "It's Marcus." She exhaled sharply, not with relief, but a different kind of tension. Marcus approached slowly, hands up. No threat. He looked older than the last time she'd seen him. Weathered like her, but still steady. He stopped at the bottom step. "I had to come," he said. "I saw the patrol reports. Someone reported movement near your land. Might have been a drone. Might have been a warden." Grace didn't blink. "You told them?" "No," he said. "But someone will." He looked past her toward the barn. "They're still here, aren't they?" Grace nodded. He sighed. "You need to let them go." She motioned for him to come inside. They sat at the kitchen table in silence. Rosie lay near the door, body stretched out protectively, her eyes never leaving Marcus. "I can't," Grace said finally. "You haven't seen them with her. They think she's their mother." Marcus lowered his voice. "They're growing fast. And one wrong move, one scared neighbor, one news report, and they're not cubs anymore. They're threats." Grace clenched her jaw. "They've never hurt anyone." "I know. But the world doesn't care. You raised them with love. That doesn't change what they are to them." They sat for a long time. Then Marcus pulled out a folded map. "There's a place," he said. "Private land. Partner of a wildlife reserve. No cages. No press. They can grow up there. With each other." Grace's eyes filled. "And Rosie?" Marcus hesitated. "She can't stay with them forever, but maybe for the transition." Outside, snow began to fall again. Grace went to the barn alone that night. Rosie followed without command. Tank rushed her, as always, bowling her over. Willow pressed her head into her hand the way she always did when afraid. Grace sat with them for over an hour. Rosie curled around them all, and she whispered things she didn't think she'd ever say out loud. "You made me feel like a mother again. You gave her a second chance, and I don't know how I'll let you go." The sun barely crested the ridge when Grace loaded the sled. She wrapped Willow and Tank in thick wool blankets and laid down straw inside the reinforced trailer Marcus had brought. Rosie jumped in without hesitation, turning in a slow circle before settling between the cubs like a black and tan guardian. Her upright ears scanned the horizon, but her body language was calm. This wasn't fear, it was focus. Grace stood for a long moment, hand resting on the trailer gate. She wasn't ready, but she knew they were. The ride was quiet. Marcus drove, eyes on the road ahead. Grace sat in the back seat, watching through the narrow slit in the trailer where she could glimpse fur and breath and the occasional twitch of a paw. They drove for hours through the white silence of Montana's winter, through the ache of knowing this was the last time the world would be small and just theirs. The reserve wasn't marked on any map. A long dirt path turned off the main road, flanked by snow-laden evergreens. At the top of the hill stood a large open enclosure, tall fencing camouflaged with trees and snow. And beyond that space, acres of it. Hills, rocks, streams, half-frozen untouched woods. It didn't look like captivity. It looked like possibility. The reserve's director, a kind woman named Ellen, met them at the gate. She didn't ask many questions, she didn't have to. She knelt by the trailer and waited. No sudden movements, just silence and warmth. When the door opened, Willow stepped out first, cautiously sniffing the air, head low. Then Tank, bounding past her, already curious, nosing the snow like it was a game. Rosie followed last. She didn't look at Ellen, she looked at Grace. Grace knelt down and wrapped her arms around Rosie's neck, burying her face in the thick German shepherd fur. "You did something no one else could," she whispered. "You saved them. You saved me." Rosie licked her cheek once, then pulled away and followed the cubs through the gate. The next hour was a blur. Grace signed forms. Marcus handled the legal loose ends. Ellen gave soft instructions about monitoring, transition, limited exposure. Then it was done. The gate closed from the other side. Rosie sat with the cubs curled against her side under a tree. They didn't look afraid. They looked home. Grace placed a small photo on the desk inside the reserve's cabin before she left. A printed image of Rosie with the cubs curled up beside her in the barn, hay scattered, light pouring through the cracks. On the back she wrote only, "Love is not biology. It's choice." On the way home, Marcus asked, "You okay?" Grace didn't answer right away. Then, as they crossed the ridge, she turned her face to the window and said softly, "Not yet." She closed her eyes. "But I will be." Spring came slow that year. The snow lingered longer than usual. But Grace didn't mind. She kept busy with repairs, tending her small garden, walking the trails with an extra leash in her pocket, the one that used to belong to Rosie. Every few weeks, a letter arrived from the reserve. Always handwritten. Always signed warmly, Ellen. Inside were updates. Tank is learning to climb. Willow watches the river more than the others. Rosie is doing well. She still sleeps beside them. Grace read every word twice. Then she folded the letters and placed them neatly in a small wooden box labeled family. 6 months passed. Then, one afternoon in July, Marcus showed up unannounced. He didn't say anything, just handed her an envelope. Inside was a photo, Rosie, Tank, Willow, all three sitting beneath a pine tree. Older. Stronger. But still connected. Below the photo was a short message in Ellen's handwriting. "They remember. Would you like to visit?" Grace stood at the edge of the enclosure, breath caught in her throat. She had expected distance. Disconnection. Maybe even fear. But what she saw was none of that. Tank was the first to turn. He stood tall now, heavy with muscle and confidence, but his eyes lit up like a spark when they met hers. He let out a low, familiar grunt and began to walk, not with the lumbering curiosity of a wild bear, but the eager pace of a child recognizing home. Willow followed, slower, more reserved, but with the same unmistakable awareness. And Rosie, she didn't walk. She ran. She met Grace at the fence, tail high, body stretching forward as far as it could go, her face full of joy and memory. Grace dropped to her knees, reaching through the barrier to press her hand into the thick fur she hadn't touched in half a year. "Hi, Mama," she whispered. "I missed you, too." They gave her time. Ellen and the staff let her walk the perimeter, speak softly through the wire, sit in the shade near the spot where the cubs, now nearly grown, lounged in the sun. They still came to Rosie when they were unsure. Still leaned into her when they needed comfort. The wild had changed them. But it hadn't taken away who they were. Before she left, Ellen gave her a parting gift, a framed photo of the trio standing at the water's edge, Rosie between them, the sun casting long shadows behind them. No cages. No signs. Just a family. Back at home, Grace hung the photo above the fireplace. And every morning, she'd sip her tea and smile at it, whispering softly, "You're doing just fine." She never tried to replace them. Never needed to. Because love like that doesn't leave you. It just changes shape. And sometimes, it grows stronger in the quiet.